If you're watching this right now, hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to tell you isn't a story. It's my confession. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 34. I work as an electrical engineer in a small town in Ohio, and until last year I thought UFOs were just something for conspiracy forums and late-night radio. I was wrong. They came for me, they hunted me, and I don't know if I'll ever really escape. It started one night in late September. I was driving back from a job site about 20 miles outside town. It was just after midnight, roads empty, sky clear, one of those nights where the air feels too still, like even the crickets don't want to make noise. As I drove past the tree line on Route 19, I noticed a light behind me. At first, I thought it was just a car far back on the road, headlights bouncing slightly over the uneven asphalt. But then I realized something. There was no engine sound, no beams stretching across the ground, just a perfect circle of white light hanging above the road, keeping distance, but always following. I slowed down, pulled over, and the light stopped. My chest tightened. I reached for my phone to take a photo, but the screen flickered and went black. The radio went static. Even the engine sputtered as though something was draining the power. I floored it, heart slamming against my ribs, but no matter how fast I drove, the light kept perfect pace with me, like it was studying me. Eventually, just a mile before town, the light shot straight up into the night sky and vanished without a sound. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? I forced myself to think it was some kind of drone, maybe military, maybe experimental tech. But deep down I knew it wasn't. That wasn't the end. Over the next weeks, the same light appeared again and again. Sometimes outside my apartment window at 3 a.m., sometimes in my rearview mirror on the empty roads where no other car should have been. I stopped sleeping. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, with the sense that someone had been in the room, watching me. My coworkers noticed. "You look like hell, man," one of them told me. I laughed it off, but inside I was breaking. Things got worse in November. I had driven out to visit my sister 2 towns over. On the way back, halfway through the farmland stretch, the same light descended again. But this time it wasn't alone. 3 or 4 of them appeared in a triangular formation, moving silently above the fields. They weren't random. They were coordinated, deliberate. I pulled the car over and stepped out, my legs shaking, because at that point I couldn't pretend anymore. I stood there, staring up at those lights hovering maybe 100 feet above the ground, perfectly still. Then, without warning, one broke formation and dropped lower. I swear I could feel the vibration in my bones, not like sound, but like pressure inside my skull. My vision blurred. My knees buckled. When I came to, I was lying in the driver's seat with the engine still running, 3 hours later, miles from where I'd stopped. The clock read 3:17 a.m. My clothes were damp, like I'd been sweating, and my watch had stopped ticking. That's when the nightmares began. They weren't normal dreams. They felt like memories leaking through the cracks. A room lit too brightly, white walls that seemed to breathe, and shapes around me. Tall, thin, their heads elongated, eyes so black they swallowed me whole. I'd wake up screaming, convinced that they were still standing by my bed. I tried telling myself it was stress, insomnia, maybe some form of hallucination, but then I noticed something I couldn't explain. A small scar on my left forearm, perfectly circular, like something had been inserted and removed. I never remembered injuring myself there. I couldn't stop staring at it. That was when I knew they weren't just following me. They had already taken me once, and maybe I hadn't even realized it until too late. They came back faster than I expected, and this time they didn't just observe, they left evidence I couldn't ignore. After that night in November, I started recording everything. Not because I trusted the footage to prove anything to anyone. My phone still acted weird whenever the lights were near, but because writing things down was the only way I could keep track of my own life. I kept a notebook in my glove compartment and scribbled the date, time, what I remembered, even the fragrance in the air if there was one. Patterns emerged. They preferred clear nights, roads that cut through open fields, places where the horizon was flat enough for their lights to dominate the sky. They timed their approaches around when I was alone. In December, the local sheriff stopped me. I'd filed a report after I found the circular scar on my arm and the missing hours. At first they were polite, then they were unnerved. "We get prank calls," he said, flipping through the thin stack of photos on his tablet. When I mentioned the lights following me, he squinted and said something like, "People see things at night." But his voice had a length to it, like he wasn't convinced of his own dismissal. I noticed him looking at the radar log for our county later in the police blotter. He didn't tell me that. I just saw him glance at my truck like he was trying to map the places we both frequented. Whatever mattered to him stayed hidden behind the professional wall. I didn't tell my sister much. I couldn't risk putting her in the middle of whatever this was. But my behavior changed so visibly that she started leaving casseroles at my door and calling me at odd hours. "Dan, you look like you haven't slept in days," she'd say, and I'd lie and tell her work was rough. The truth was I was careful not to be alone in bright places anymore. I drove with lights on, kept the radio loud, left the TV humming all night. The more I resisted the silence, the more anxious I became. It was February when the real escalation happened. I was walking home from the corner store, a plastic bag with milk and bread in my hand, when a humming filled the air, low, like a tuning fork you could feel in your teeth. I looked up and there it was, a disc-shaped shadow cutting the moon, moving with a smooth, impossible grace. This time the light wasn't far behind. It was in my backyard before I even reached my door. My dog, my God, he used to be fearless, urged me to move, tail stiff, hackles raised. I fumbled my keys and the backyard light flattened everything into stark, high-contrast shadows. Then I saw movement on the porch. A figure, taller than a man, thin shoulders, its outline too perfect. It didn't walk. It glided, the way something would if it had no joints to betray motion. I remember thinking in that instant that I should run, that every instinct I had trained since childhood to flee danger should kick in, but something heavier than fear held me to the step. The figure turned toward me. Its face, if it was a face, was not like ours. Big, vacant eyes, no nose I could see, skin like a dull metal. And then a sound hit me, not a noise but a pressure, like the words were physically forcing themselves into my head. "We need. You must." It wasn't in English, but for some reason every syllable translated into meaning as precise as a blade. I dropped the bag. Milk splashed onto the porch boards. The dog whimpered. The figure lifted something small and needle-like toward my forearm, the same place as before. I shouted, a raw animal sound, surprising even myself. The figure paused, cocking its head as if curious about my vocal cords. Behind it, the light pulsed, and for a second everything sharpened. The smell of ozone, the metallic tang on my tongue, the way the porch light flickered and died. Then the world tunneled. I remember falling, the taste of copper, total darkness. I woke up on the kitchen floor 27 minutes later with my watch stopped and the bag of groceries miraculously intact beside me. Bread squashed but whole. The clock read 3:02 a.m. I had new marks on my inner arm, 2 small punctures, close together, and a pale bruise that looked like a thumbprint. My phone had a recording file I didn't make, 3 minutes of a high-pitched tone layered with a low hum. I couldn't play it for more than a few seconds without my head splitting. The next day, I took the file to an audio engineer I knew from work. He looked at the waveform and went white. "This isn't from around here," he said, using technical terms I half understood, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. He refused to copy the file. "Don't let this spread," he muttered, pushing his chair back as if the sound might leak out of the speakers and into the air like a contagion. That's when I realized that the fear I felt wasn't only mine anymore. People who touched the edges of my experience recoiled. A pattern of silence was forming around me. Colleagues who suddenly had projects abroad, friends who stopped answering texts, a neighbor who covered his security camera with a tarp the night after he waved me in the street. I tried to document everything with a cheap camcorder I'd bought online, something analog that shouldn't be as susceptible to interference. I set it to record in my truck overnight. The footage was grainy, but at 2:47 a.m. the cam caught a blur of light outside my window, and then, impossibly, the image sharpened into an oval opening. A hand, gray and long-fingered, rested on the glass. My heart physically leapt in my throat watching the playback. On the next frame, the camera's timecode jumped ahead by 42 minutes. My hands shook so badly I could barely lift the recorder. If this was an invasion, they were being methodical. They took samples maybe of sleep, of blood, of responses when pressed. They tested my panic threshold, my ability to remember, my limits. The more I studied the footage, the less human the motives felt. It wasn't malice, exactly, and it wasn't cruelty for entertainment. It was research. They weren't monsters in the slasher movie sense. They were clinicians, clinical and cold, as if studying me were the only logical step in some experiment that spanned decades. I thought of the scar, the needles, the black eyes, and the way their presence bent the world. Phones glitching, dogs agitated, clocks losing time. And I thought of the message that pulsed in my head that night on the porch. We need. You must. What did they need? What did they want from me? I started to believe that the answer might be inside me, lodged under my skin like a small machine I couldn't feel but which controlled why they came. They kept coming, and I stopped pretending I could outrun whatever this was. In March, I made an appointment with a specialist. Had to, if only to get someone else to see the marks on my arm and the blackouts as medical facts rather than the ramblings of a broken man. The doctor ran blood work and a CT, asked a dozen clinical questions with a neutral face. When I mentioned the lights and the puncture marks, she frowned but kept her notes precise, professional. Reported blackout episodes, localized skin lesions, transient amnesia. Nothing in the tests explained the strange anomalies the way I wanted them explained. The blood came back clean of known pathogens. The scans showed nothing foreign. No metal, no device. The neurologist suggested sleep studies and stress therapy. If there's a physical cause, she said, we'll find it. Her confidence felt like a lifeline and a lie in the same breath. That night I dreamt of white rooms and thin hands. The next morning I found another mark, faint but real, on the back of my neck. I started carrying my glove compartment notebook everywhere and, when possible, recording with the old camcorder I trusted, the one that had caught a hand on the window. I also began to plan. If they were studying me, maybe surveillance would reveal their pattern. I mapped every sighting in my notebook and drew lines between them like some crazed cartographer. They clustered around utility corridors, water towers, places with wide sightlines and few neighbors. They favored the curve of Route 19 and the abandoned airstrip outside town. The map looked like a spiderweb centered on my life. In April, I drove to the airstrip before dawn, camera mounted on the dashboard, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The sky was awash of stars, the air cold and sharp. I parked near the hangar and waited, knees bouncing, breath fogging in the windshield. At 2:13 a.m. something moved. No bright lights this time, just a shadow folding the stars. It descended slowly and stopped maybe 100 feet up, a silhouette against the moon. I hit record. For 20 minutes it hovered. Then one of the smaller lights peeled off and came closer, lower, until I could see it wasn't light at all but a kind of smooth shell reflecting the moon. I opened the door and the sound hit me, low, harmonized tones that made my teeth ache. I stepped forward because fear, I learned, sometimes pushes you into the one thing that might save you, knowledge. That's when a beam of cool air washed over my face and the world narrowed again. I remember the smell, ozone and something like old pennies, and then a pressure at the base of my skull like a thought being forced out and replaced. I don't know how long I was gone. I woke up on the grass, camera face down, lens cracked but still recording. The timestamp jumped ahead by 83 minutes. My shirt had mud on the sleeve and the same circular scar on my wrist had swollen slightly. Back in town, I noticed the sheriff's cruiser idling at the diner 2 nights later. He motioned me over and, After a long silence, slid an old Polaroid across the table. "You recognize this?" he asked. The picture was grainy, taken from a distance, my truck, headlights off, parked at the airstrip 2 nights before. Someone had taken a photo of me there. The kicker was the second image on the back. An unmarked patch of the sky above the truck where the grain pattern shifted and a small dark oval seemed to blur the stars. He looked tired in a way I'd never seen. "You're not the first to say this," he whispered. "We don't have answers." That admission changed things. It made the threat real in an official way, but it also made it scary in a bureaucratic way. Like there were forces larger than any one sheriff, quiet and precise, arranging silence. I started to suspect people I'd once called friends. My boss asked me to take a sudden, unpaid leave to get my head straight. My neighbor across the hall moved out overnight, leaving a cardboard box in the doorway with a note. "Sorry, can't be here." The paranoia that had been a private pestilence expanded into a community-wide hush. I tried to fight back by telling my sister everything. Every light, every blackout, the punctures, the noises. Her voice did something I'd been bracing for. It cracked. "Dan," she said, "you need to leave. Go somewhere far. Get away from town." I told her I couldn't run forever, that they followed patterns, not borders. She sent me a one-way ticket to her friend's cabin in Vermont, booked for a week. I almost left, but the thought of sitting in a strange house and checking behind curtains every hour felt more like exile than safety. Besides, I'd started noticing changes I couldn't explain. Strangers who smiled a moment too long in the grocery aisle. A woman at the gas station who held my gaze like she was counting the lines on my face. A delivery driver who took a little too much interest in the timestamps on my packages. They were watching the watchers. And even if I fled, what did I flee to? The marks on my body seemed to be the only constant tethering me to whatever purpose they had. So I did something worse. I baited them. I left the camcorder on the kitchen table and went out to the front porch. I sat where they could see me and waited, hands empty, heart a metronome. The first thing I felt was the sound, soft as a violin, then a cool wash of air across my face. A figure stood at the edge of the porch light, pale and tall. It didn't approach. It only watched. For the first time, I tried to talk to it aloud. "Why me?" I asked, voice small. The reply came not as words, but as an image shoved into my mind. Fields drying, children with strange breaths, numbers like coordinates, and then, sharp and clinical, "Host." The implication was blunt. I wasn't chosen at random. I was useful. The figure cocked its head, and for a second I felt, with a clarity that made bile rise in my throat, that whatever they were grafting into me or out of me wasn't merely scientific. It was evolutionary. They needed carriers, conduits to something beneath the skin of our world. My mouth went dry. As the figure retreated, the porch light flicked on and off like a heartbeat and then steadied. I could have sat there and broken down in the quiet. Instead, I laughed, a broken little sound, and stood, realizing that the one thing they hadn't predicted was my willingness to look at them and keep my eyes open. The next step, I decided, was to find the object they'd left in me, if there was anything there at all, and learn to make it tell me its story. I knew then that I had to stop hoping someone else would save me. The only person who could close this loop was me. I spent a week planning with the same clinical obsession I'd seen in their eyes. Mapping, timing, baiting, the whole stupid human arsenal of stubbornness and nerve. I charged batteries, rebuilt the old camcorder so it would run on a loop, taped it to a tripod aimed at the porch where they usually stood. I sprinkled small mirrors around the yard to catch fragments of light. I wore a shirt with a thin seam at the wrist I could rip away, kept a flashlight in my pocket and a stainless pen, useless as a weapon but good for leverage, tucked behind my teeth in case panic made my hands useless. On the night I chose, the town felt held in a single breath. The air was cold and clear, and the stars were flat and empty as coins. I went out with my dog on a leash, left the back door unlocked, and sat on the porch until my fingers went numb. At 2:01 a.m., the sky folded. It was never violent. There's a grace to their approach that makes it worse, like someone removing all the sound from a room before they speak. The light pooled on the grass. Then a figure stepped out of it and stood at the margin of the porch light. It watched me the way a scientist watches petri dishes, and when it spoke, when it put an image straight into my mind, I forced myself not to flinch. This time the message was longer, layered with images and concepts rather than single words. Drought, seeds, carriers, long circuits of migration, failing worlds. It was clinical, resigned. It needed hosts to ferry something across the threshold between their world and ours. A virus, a symbiont, a memory, whatever you wanted to name it. The image ended on me. They had been harvesting and testing, looking for one that would carry the burden without collapsing. That was what we need. You must. Meant. They weren't monsters of malice. They were logisticians of survival. I felt, absurdly, like a delegate at a council where I'd been made to speak for my species without permission. I asked them why they chose me, and the answer came like a calendar of data. Compatibility of the immune response, stability in stress tests, geography. Dry, bureaucratic metrics. There was no comfort in that. What surprised me was the hesitancy I felt from them, a pause in their otherwise clinical rhythm, and almost curiosity about my agency. They had measured me but never expected me to understand. I understood because anger cleared the fog. I felt small and furious and very human. I stood up. "I won't be your vessel," I said out loud, the words thin but steady. Their head tilted. The figure raised a hand, not a threat, an offer. The air pressed at my temples and behind my eyes. For a second I saw again the white room, and then something else. A tiny bead, no larger than a pea, tucked just beneath the skin of my left forearm, where the first circular scar had been. I hadn't felt it, but I knew it was there. They had assumed it would remain unseen, a silent passenger. I had planned for that possibility. Over the last month, I'd made a small tool from the pen, a clip from a paper binder, a strip of mirror glass to see what my hands could not. I had rehearsed the motion to pull the seam, to find the bead by touch and not by sight. Now, standing on the porch with the creature watching, I ripped the cuff of my sleeve, pressed my thumb flat against the spot until the skin rolled like dough, and dug. Pain bloomed, a hot electric flare, but pain is honest and I clung to it. My fingers closed around something slick and cool. I pulled, and for a moment I thought the world would tilt. My vision shivered like heat above asphalt. But the bead came free, small and iridescent, pulsing faintly as if alive. The figure made a sound that translated into the thought. Retrieval. Without thinking, I threw the bead against the porch railing and it shattered like a glowing glass. The light that escaped was not loud, but it was wrong. An immediate, wrenching chord that made the hairs on my arms lift. For a beat, the beings reeled. Then, instead of anger, what I saw on the face hovering, there was something like grief, pure and sharp, and a calculation that folded quickly to inevitability. The air thrummed. The porch light flickered. The dog, brave only in the face of human will, whined and pressed against my leg. The figure retreated a step, then another, the light thinning as if a valve had been closed. Behind it, the sky flashed once. A careful bloom of white that traced the edges of the hangar roof across town. They lifted, the harmonics wound down like a dial, and the empty field swallowed the sound. When the stars came back into place, the porch smelled of ozone and old pennies and my hand bled where the bead had been. I laughed then, a raw sound that was equal parts relief and hysteria. I had no idea if I'd saved anyone but myself, or if destroying that bead meant I'd only delayed something inevitable. But I felt the arc of agency return to me in a way I hadn't felt since it began. The broken glass sparkled in the gutter like tiny, alien dew. In the days that followed, there was a new pattern. The lights came less often, and when they did, they hovered farther back, watching with an almost clinical sorrow. People eased back into their lives like floodwaters receding. The sheriff stopped sliding Polaroids across diner tables and started pretending the photos were forgeries. I went to the doctor again with the raw wound on my arm, and when the tests came back they found nothing extraordinary. No foreign metal, no pathogen. Just a scar and a bruise that faded. The neurologist recommended therapy. I agreed not because it would cure anything, but because it offered language for what I'd lived through. I found comfort in writing, in stringing together the nights and the fear and the small act of tearing a seed out of my flesh. A month later, I uploaded the camcorder footage to a private server and sent a copy to an independent journalist I'd come to trust. Someone who'd once covered environmental contamination and had the habits of someone who believed in inconvenient truths. He called 2 days later with a hoarse voice and a plan. He wouldn't publish everything. He said the world wasn't ready for the kind of certainty my videos offered and that parts would be redacted to keep people safe while the work of corroboration continued. He asked me if I was willing to talk on record, and for the first time since September I said yes. There are nights, even now, when a light will tint the curtains and something in my gut will hitch. My dog sometimes stares at the ceiling and whines at nothing that is obvious. My arm still looks ordinary, but sometimes in the dark I catch the faint suggestion of a seam if I press the skin just so. And for a second the world tilts and I remember the bead and the look on the thing's face as if it had lost more than a tool when I broke it. I don't know if I truly stopped them. I don't know what their next step will be. What I do know is this: I took back one small piece of myself, and in that act I learned what it means to be stubbornly human, to prefer messy, painful freedom over the quiet logic of being useful. If you're watching, subscribe not because I want numbers, but because if something like this ever touches your life, I want there to be a place to tell the truth. Record. Tell someone you trust. Don't let it be a private shrinking into fear. We are messy, loud, inconvenient. Sometimes that's the only thing between us and whatever cold calculus would make us instruments. Tonight the sky is clear, and the stars look ordinary. My watch ticks again. But when I walk outside at night, I still feel watched, and I still check my left arm with a nervous thumb. Sometimes, in the distance, a light moves in a way that makes my teeth ache. I breathe, count to 10, and keep moving forward.